Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of Conversing on Africa's Peace, a podcast focused on the African Union's Peace and Security Council and key related issues produced monthly by Amani Africa Media and Research Services. As always, Sion with you from Amani Africa. Today, my colleague Tifsahet is joining me.
Hi, Sion.
Hi, how are you? Welcome to this episode.
Thank you.
So, as you know, Tifsahet, Angola, one of the new members of the PSC that joined the council in April of this year, will be assuming the role of chairing the council during the coming month of July. So this makes, Angola the first of the 10 new members of the council that were elected by the 44th Ordinary Session of the Executive Council in February of this year to be chairing the PSC. So that's one interesting fact to tell our listeners. According to the month's program of work, the PSC is expected to deliberate on 5 agenda items, which will cover, as usual, both country-specific situations and also thematic issues. So in addition to its deliberations on these substantive agenda items, the program of work also envisages a field mission to Mozambique, and there will also be an informal consultation of the PSC with the CPAPs. That is the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. And this will be focused on early warning issues. So, as always, before we forge ahead with our reflections on what to expect from PSC's upcoming meetings and activities in July, let's do a quick recap on what transpired during the previous month of June.
Okay, in the previous months, in June, Uganda presided over the Peace and Security Council, and 6 sessions were convened during the month. The council convened at all 3 levels: ambassadorial, ministerial, and heads of states. That's interesting, given that doesn't mostly happen.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, and in addition to discussing the UN Security Council Resolution 2719, for the first time since its adoption in December 2023, the Peace and Security Council also conducted a summit-level meeting on the situation in Sudan. The Peace and Security Council also convened a session to deliberate on post-ATMIS security arrangements for Somalia and AU's engagement after the final drawdown of the transition mission by the end of December 2024.
Yeah, so all of these interesting issues were covered in June, in addition to some other sessions. But just maybe to expound a little bit on the PSC session on UN Security Council Resolution 2719. As you've said, Tefi, this was the first time that the Council actually convened a session to discuss the resolution since its adoption. So, further to welcoming the key attributes of the resolution and, noting its adoption as a step forward in UN-AU partnership in the maintenance of global peace and security, the discussion also enabled members of the Council to reflect on, some critical issues, including how the resolution shall be implemented going forward. So just to highlight some of these for our listeners, the PSC members deliberated, on the fact that notwithstanding that 2719 is, a landmark resolution, of course, there still is a need to be, or a need to have focused discussions around some of its aspects, which still sort of require further clarity and also some kind of aligned understanding between the PSC and the UN Security Council. For instance, an issue was raised around the fact that, given 2719 enables access to UN-assessed contributions on this case-by-case basis, there is this lingering question on how the AU and UN would coordinate in concrete terms for the purposes of establishing, what would constitute scenarios or cases that shall warrant having access to assessed contributions. Another point that council members reflected on relates to, the issue of burden sharing. And in that respect, emphasis was made on the need for further reflections on how the AU and UN will jointly mobilize 25% of the funds as is envisaged in the resolution, because the resolution clearly enables access to UN-assessed contributions up to 75%. Aside, from these key issues, some interesting remarks were also highlighted, including the potential use of 2719 to access finances for funding AU's post-ATMIS engagement in Somalia. This is something the PSC has clearly indicated in its previous session on Somalia and ATMIS's operations. I believe that was the 1205 session, which took place in May. Aside from that, there was also mention of possibility of the use of the resolution to enable access to funds for the purposes of supporting engagements of Sami DRC and Eastern DRC. And also importantly, noting that some UN Security Council member states have been adopting these non-papers, there was a proposal that the AU Commission also develops a paper which sort of elucidates AU's understanding of UN Security Council Resolution 2719, and, which would also sort of provide guidance to member states on this particular issue. So these were some of the interesting features from that specific session. Tefia, what are your thoughts on the other ones?
Well, for the ATMIS, the UN Security Council Resolution 2790 is linked to the ATMIS session.
Yeah.
There is a point where I'll touch on that from the outcome of the Peace and Security Council communique.
Yeah.
The Peace and Security Council held a briefing on the situation in Somalia and the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia. During the session, while commending the progress made by the Somalia security forces in addressing the capacity gaps during Phase 1 and Phase 2 drawdown of ATMIS forces, concerns were raised about the potential risks that are associated with the Phase 3 drawdown of ATMIS forces, especially amidst the ongoing operations against Al-Shabaab. To address these concerns, I think our listeners will recall that the federal government of Somalia has proposed a phased approach to the drawdown of 4,000 personnel, splitting it into two stages, 2,000 by the end of June and another 2,000 by the end of September 2024. And in this regard, while noting that this approach has financial implications, the Peace and Security Council reiterated its October 2023 communique, and this communique highlights various options for resource mobilization. And according to that communique, the Peace and Security Council in the recent session requested the AU Commission to explore these options to support the phased drawdown of Phase 3. With ATMIS set to exit in December 2024, the Peace and Security Council emphasized the importance of a smooth transition to a new African Union-led mission to prevent any security vacuum. The Peace and Security Council also endorsed the establishment of this new mission that's authorized by the United Nations to support the federal government of Somalia in post-ATMIS security arrangements. In the communique adopted by the session, the Peace and Security Council also indicated that the mission's focus will be on degrading Al-Shabaab, providing security, and also supporting state-building priorities. The Council also decided that the mandate of the new mission should be responsive to Somalia's political and security context, ensuring realistic timelines for a smooth, orderly, and benchmarked transition of security responsibilities to the Somalia security forces. And with regards to the conceptualization of the mission, the Council tasked the African Union Commission, in consultation with ATMIS and the federal government of Somalia and other stakeholders, to submit a concept of operations by the end of July 2024. And the concept of operations will outline the new mission's mandate, configuration, and clear benchmarks and timelines for the transition from ATMIS to the new mission. Mm-hmm. Besides these decisions, the Peace and Security Council highlighted the importance of predictable and sustainable funding for the new mission and called for the establishment of a dedicated funding mechanism, potentially through UN-assessed contributions along with additional sources. This is the point where I was talking about the UN Security Council Resolution 2719. With regards to that, the Peace and Security Council requested the AU Commission, in consultation with the UN Secretariat, to develop financing options for the new mission, including through the UN Security Council Resolution 2719. So in the upcoming months, we expect to get updates on the implementation of these decisions, as the AU Commission is directed by the Peace and Security Council to inform the Council regularly on the implementation of the communique adopted by the session.
Yeah, that's interesting, Taifi. How about your take on Sudan?
Yes, Jihan. In addition to ATMIS, the other significant session that took place in the previous month was the session on Sudan. It was held on 21 June at the heads of states and government level. The session concluded with a communique outlining several commendable measures aimed at addressing the crisis.
Yeah.
Among these commendable measures, I will mention few. The first is it called for the establishment of a presidential ad hoc committee composed of leaders from various regions of the continent. This committee will be tasked with mobilizing the collective influence of African Union member states to bring the warring parties to the negotiating table. I believe this is a significant move, as the establishment of a committee that could create the collective weight of the African Union member states could bring substantial diplomatic pressure on the warring parties in Sudan. And the second measure was that the Peace and Security Council Sanctions Committee was assigned to identify and list individuals and entities supplying weapons and financial support to the conflicting parties. And this could help in bringing a significant reduction in the resources available to sustain the conflict and could also deter external actors from fueling the violence. So it's an important one. Thirdly, the African Union Commission, in collaboration with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, was directed to take concrete action towards investigating atrocities committed during the conflict. And lastly, the other measure, also the important one, was the proposal that was made to hold an extraordinary summit at the African Union to further address the situation and ensure sustained efforts towards peace. In my opinion, this summit could foster greater regional collaboration and ensure that member states are aligned in their efforts to address the crisis. So that makes it an important and very pertinent to the ongoing processes.
Yeah. That's true, Taifi. I think these were actually very concrete decisions that the council has adopted. Like you have said, very commendable. I believe also the decision for the newly inaugurated sanctions committee to undertake the task of, identifying actors is a very significant step and hopefully something that will be followed up on and implemented as per the council's request. So having reflected, on these perhaps major and most anticipated sessions from June, we can forge ahead to see what the council will be engaged with during the month of July 2024. So as I mentioned earlier, we're expecting 5 substantive agenda items to be considered by the council during July. The first one of these will be held on the 5th, and it will be an open session. It will be aimed at, brainstorming on the Summit of the Future. An interesting topic and a topic we're seeing on the agenda for the first time. So as we all may know by now, the Summit of the Future will be taking place in September this year. It's essentially aimed at, enabling world leaders to deliberate on finding multilateral solutions for a better tomorrow. That's also how the Summit of the Future is framed. So this is essentially, a summit which is proposed by the UN Secretary General in his 2021 report, Our Common Agenda, which essentially outlines his vision for the future of multilateralism. So as the timeline for the Summit of the Future quick approaches, PSC's convening of this session, we can say is very critical. It would allow, members of the council to reflect on and also establish common, or rather shared perspectives on Africa's asks from a reformed multilateralism, and also Africa's contributions towards revitalizing the current multilateral system, which, in many ways has failed to deliver and is also faced with considerable challenge, particularly, I would say, in the area of maintaining peace and security. So, I believe this session offers the members of the council to brainstorm around finding solid solutions for a more accommodating multilateral system towards addressing our current challenges in peace and security. But also the session, I believe, presents a particular chance for council members to share their thinkings around, ongoing conversations regarding the reform of the UN Security Council and how to advance African stance in that respect. So what other sessions do we have? Maybe Taifi, if you take over.
Yeah, there are other sessions in the month. On 9 July, the Peace and Security Council is set to hold an informal consultation with the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security on Continental Early Warning System. This consultation is being held according to the 30th Peace and Security Council retreat on its working methods. During that retreat, the Peace and Security Council agreed to a monthly informal consultation between the Peace and Security Council ambassadors and the Commissioner for Political Affairs and Peace and Security. Yeah.
So what would you say, Tafi, what makes this consultation significant?
Well, first and foremost, it's a chance for the Commission and the Council to share sensitive early warning information. This is crucial because it helps in the anticipation, preparedness, and early response to conflicts across the continent. And in addition to that, enhancing and fully operationalizing the continental early warning system is expected to be another priority of the session. And this meeting will delve into ways to achieve that. But that's not all. In addition to those important points, the discussions will also tackle the institutional and technical challenges facing the continental early warning system. Plus, it's also expected that they will follow up on decisions made during the Peace and Security Council session that took place on 14 April 2024.
Interesting. Yeah, definitely. You've highlighted, I believe, what should really be the center point of the informal consultation. So yeah, following that, the PSC will convene its third session for the month on the 11th of July. This will be dedicated, to an update on the situation in the Central African Republic. Interestingly, this session will be held exactly a year after the last time that the Council discussed developments in CAR. So it's been quite a while. Just to provide some highlights on what's happening in CAR to our listeners. So while, the overall security situation in the country has somewhat improved since the last time that the PSC discussed the situation, violence still persists across some of its regions, with continued attacks perpetrated by the CPC, or the Coalition of Patriots for Change, which is the main rebel group in the country. In terms of political developments, a key issue that is likely to receive the Council's attention is the upcoming local elections in CAR, which are scheduled for October 2024. As we all recall, initially the local election was slated for July 2023, but it was postponed to enable the conduct of a constitutional referendum, which took place on the 30th of July 2023. So, interestingly, the referendum has now enabled the adoption of a new constitution, which raises the presidential term from 5 to 7 years. And it also scraps the 2-term limit. So this essentially, what it does is it gives the current leader, President Todra, green light to seek a 3rd term in office. So, aside from looking into preparations for the conduct of the local elections this year, it's critical for council members to also reflect on this constitutional amendment, which is clearly, one of the key factors that has in the past and continues to currently precipitate coups in multiple member states across the continent. So in addition to this, another key aspect which also warrants PSC's interest is, the progress being made in the implementation of the PAPR, which is, the 2019 political agreement for peace and reconciliation in CAR. And in that respect, some of the advances which have been made towards dissolution and disarmament of some armed groups may be marked and also welcomed by the Council. Aside from that, it may also be of interest for the Council to sort of emphasize, or rather re-emphasize, the importance of dialogue among existing armed groups and the leadership in CAR for having sustainable peace in the country. On the humanitarian front, CAR continues to struggle with displacement crisis. And more recently, this has become very complex due to the influx of refugees and returnees as a result of the war in Sudan. So the PSC is likely also to reflect on this particular challenge that CAR is facing at the moment. And it may call for, concerted efforts to support humanitarian actors in the country.
Okay. Yeah, we also have another country-specific session in addition to CAR. That's the session on DRC. It's scheduled for 15 July. And the Peace and Security Council will deliberate on the pivotal role of mediation and reconciliation in resolving conflicts in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, with a specific focus on the Luanda and Nairobi processes. If our listeners recall, During its 1203rd session, the Peace and Security Council underscored the significance of diplomatic efforts embodied in these initiatives. And the Nairobi and the Luanda processes are ongoing regional endeavors. Just to give a highlight or a background on these two processes. And these two processes are facilitated by the East African Community and the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. The Nairobi process aims to mediate between the government of the DRC and various armed groups operating in the eastern region, while the Luanda process seeks to address the interstate dimensions of the eastern DRC crisis through dialogue involving the DRC and Rwanda. Despite persistent conflicts involving groups such as the M23 and current stalls in both processes, the Peace and Security Council's agenda is expected to include receiving updates on conflict dynamics and peace efforts, as well as strategizing to overcome obstacles hindering progress in these peace initiatives. The security situation in the country has deteriorated, particularly in North Kivu. Ongoing conflicts persists between the Congolese armed forces, bolstered by local allied militias called Wazalendo and the Movement 23, the M23. According to the UN Secretary General's report, the M23 has extended its territorial influence and is pushing towards Goma, the provincial capital. There is also a dire humanitarian situation with 6 million people internally displaced in eastern DRC due to the heightened insecurity. In response to the growing insecurity in the country, the Congolese armed forces has also been received support from the regional force deployed in eastern DRC by the Southern African Development Community. The mission is called SAMI DRC. So in relation to that, it's expected that the session will address how this mission can collaborate with and reinforce the Nairobi and the Luanda process. Following that session, on 24 July, the Peace and Security Council will hold another important thematic issue to deliberate on the future of peace support operations, focusing on financing, new configurations, coordination, lessons learned, and best practices. As it was discussed before, just a month prior, on 14 June 2024, the Peace and Security Council held a meeting that presented differing viewpoints on the UN Security Council Resolution 2719, and a decision was not reached. So now for the upcoming session that's planned for 24 July, the PCC will convene to delve deeper into the modalities for the implementation of Resolution 2719 and to also discuss questions like what lessons could be gleaned from past peace support operations and how could this shape future strategies. These are a few of the sessions from my side. Zion, if there are any additional sessions that you would like to add.
Thanks, Steffi, for the reflections. Just one more session, which would constitute the last substantive engagement for the PSC during the month of July. And this will be held on the 25th. It will be dedicated to the Council's regular consideration of the media report of the chairperson of the AU Commission on Elections in Africa. So as we all may already know, the PSC considers the chairperson's report on elections twice every year. The first one, takes place at the beginning of each year, and it enables consideration of elections that took place during the second half of the previous year. The second one takes place mid-year, and it provides key inputs regarding elections which were conducted during the first half of the current year. So within that framework, the coming session offers the PSC the chance to be updated on elections which were conducted during the first half of 2024. So, this would include, of course, the most recently concluded election in South Africa, and also the interesting aspects from Senegal's presidential election, which took place earlier on in March. So, the session really serves as an occasion to reflect on some of the salient features of these and other elections conducted during the report period. And it also enables the Council to draw some of the best practices, which, should be replicated in the future. In addition, the chairperson's report will also present the PSC with some outlook on, key upcoming elections, which are expected to be held in the second half of 2024. This would, include countries such as Mozambique, which continues to confront insecurity in its northern region, but also, other conflict-affected member states such as Libya and South Sudan, which may potentially, conduct their long-awaited elections. So it should be an interesting session as well. Any other reflections from your side, Taifi?
In addition to the substantive sessions, I would like to point out that there will be a field mission to Mozambique that will be held from 29 to 31. You have mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
And when looking at the country situation in Mozambique, since December 2023, there has been a rise in violent attacks against civilians in the northern region of Mozambique, which is called Cabo Delgado province. Compared to 51 attacks claimed by the ISM in 2023, the group has already claimed 57 attacks within the first few months of this year. As a result, since December 2023, 110,000 people have been internally displaced. Aside from the security and the humanitarian situation in the country, another aspect that the field mission could take into consideration is the fact that SADC has decided for a step-by-step drawdown of the SADC mission in Mozambique, starting from 15 December 2023, with a complete withdrawal to be finalized by 15 July 2024. And this makes the field mission important, as the Peace and Security Council will get the opportunity to assess measures being put in place to avoid the emergency of a security vacuum after the withdrawal of the SADC mission in Mozambique. And since the field mission is coming after the final deadline for the withdrawal, this makes it important for the Peace and Security Council to assess the situation on the ground.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks a lot, Taifi, for joining me in this episode and for those reflections. So that brings us to the end of another episode. We wish Angola a very fruitful month as it takes the chairship for July 2024. And we wish everyone taking part in the work of the PSC productive discussions on the important topics outlined briefly here today. As always, we are happy to encourage our listeners to dig deeper into the PSC's agenda, as well as the analytical work that we produce. Amani Africa is also appreciative of the support of its institutional partners and the production of our insights on the provisional program of work of the PSC each month, and we believe that this podcast is a useful accompaniment to our work. Before we go, as always, we would like to wish the following African states happy National Days of Celebration in July. So we have Burundi, Rwanda, and Somalia on the 1st of July, Algeria on 3rd of July, Cape Verde on 5th of July, the Comoros and Malawi on 6th of July, South Sudan on the 9th of July, Sao Tome and Principe on 12th of July, and Liberia on the 26th of July. Let me once again thank our listeners for joining us for this month's edition of Conversing on Africa's Peace podcast, a podcast produced monthly by Amani Africa to provide brief highlights on the monthly program of work on the AU Peace and Security Council. We wish our listeners a productive month, and we will be back next month to consider the PSC's agenda for August 2024. Until then, goodbye, and we wish you all peace and prosperity.